He's always enjoyed the kids, and he's always been a teacher at heart.
He understood schools. He could walk into a school and quickly know whether the school was engaging students or not.
Good morning, students of Jackson Street School.
He is truly apolitical. He doesn't do anything because it's going to better his career or make him look good. He genuinely does everything he does because it's what's best for kids.
He has a combination of integrity and heart and a great mind, and he put it all together into being an extremely effective commissioner and a wonderful guy to work with. He is an extraordinary man.
Don't know much about history. Don't know much biology.
David Driscoll's extraordinary career in education began 43 years ago in the classroom, teaching math to middle school students in Somerville. But he never dreamed of the effect he would one day have on all the students of Massachusetts.
It just kind of happened. He was a teacher in Somerville, then he became a teacher in Melrose at the high school, and then the superintendent of schools asked if he'd be interested in being a business manager. From there he became the superintendent. He had no ambitions to go into state government at all, and they sought him to become the deputy.
He was appointed Deputy Commissioner of Education in 1993, just days after then-Governor Bill Weld signed the state's Education Reform Act into law. 5 years later, Driscoll was named interim commissioner, but he was not the first choice of Governor Paul Cellucci or Education Board Chair John Silber, and getting the official appointment became a political firestorm.
He may not have fit the kind of prototype that John Silber and the more academic community were thinking would make a good commissioner. But I think they soon learned that not only does this commissioner have the political skills that are required for the job, he had the academic skills.
In the end, Driscoll won the appointment, with the deciding vote coming from the student board member.
She absolutely believed in him and supported him, voted for him. It's not surprising at all. Students love him. Students love him. You know, he makes them feel like the most important person in the room.
I, David P. Driscoll, do solemnly swear.
David Driscoll took on the job of commissioner and the challenge of implementing the controversial Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, better known as MCAS. State law requires students to pass the MCAS exam in math and English in order to graduate. But not everyone agreed with the requirement.
We don't need no education.
This test is flawed in so many ways that I can't even begin to list them right now.
Need no thought control.
There was a lot of concern, understandably, because it was so new for Massachusetts, that some kids would not be able to make it, that teachers and students wouldn't be able to rise to the occasion.
I recognize that they have good intentions, but frankly, they're misguided. It's wrong-headed. It might be right-hearted, but it's wrong-headed.
He had the courage of his convictions. He knew what he was standing up for at that time was essential to enforcing high expectations for all children. He saw it as a critical civil rights act.
When critics would say, this is unrealistic, this is too high a standard, you're being unfair to kids, you're asking too much of them, he would say, take the Driscoll Challenge. We post on our website samples of student work. The Driscoll Challenge is take a look at the examples of student work, look at failing work, and then you decide, are you comfortable saying that a student whose writing that is should be considered ready to graduate from high school? And it never failed. If people were willing to look at that and be honest about it, they had to admit that we owe these kids more than to pass them on with a diploma and pretend that they had the skills of a high school graduate. That was absolutely typical Dave Driscoll.
We're each waiting for the other to blink. I think he was worried that I would cave politically, and certainly I was worried that he would get cold feet from the complaints he was hearing from the field. And to, I think, the benefit of every public school student in Massachusetts, and with my great gratitude, Dave Driscoll stood up for the students in Massachusetts. He didn't blink.
Driscoll's perseverance has paid off. The number of 10th graders passing the English portion of the MCAS exam jumped from 72% the first year of the test to 94% in 2007. The number of 10th graders passing the math portion improved by 43%, and more than 95% of all students were able to graduate with a competency determination by the end of their senior year.
There were a lot of doubters a few years ago. Back in 1993, when education reform started, and back in 1998, when we began MCAS, many people had doubts. And they had doubts about you. And the thing that I think is so great today is that you have proven that you shouldn't have doubts in young people. Because if you're fair with them and you're straight with them and you give them a reasonable goal, they'll come through, and that's what you've done.
Good morning. You now know more about me than I remembered. It's great to be here, and I congratulate Tim Duffy, among others in Rhode Island, that keep trying and keep pushing. And it's great to watch from a distance. I think someday you're going to get some traction, and today could be the beginning of it. I'm a little bit embarrassed to talk about school equity and equity funding in Massachusetts as the model, when the headline in the Boston Globe last Sunday, the headline of the whole Globe, the whole Sunday Globe, was that we are now entering our fourth decade of inequity in funding, and that Worcester and Brockton, and I guess you could replace that with Woonsocket and Pawtucket, but Worcester and Brockton are seriously thinking of bringing suit against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So here I am as the ideal. However, with those problems, and we do have problems, one of the things that happened in Massachusetts, the foundation budget was tremendous. Not only was it $2 billion in new money over 7 years, signed by a governor, by the way, who said we're not going to raise taxes, and we didn't. We grew the economy. And we're able to fund that formula, most of the money going to poor districts to bring everybody up to a foundation. But since that time, while technically on the books, districts are at foundation, which is a very good thing, nonetheless, the increases and the monies they receive from the state have been more than offset by just the costs of annual cost of doing business, things like fuel oil and buses and that kind of thing. And, of course, the big two, health insurance and special education costs. So the poor districts of Massachusetts, the urban districts, et cetera, have a point that even though they're at foundation, the support from the state has not been enough to keep up with the tremendous costs that they have. And we're starting to see school class size go up and that kind of thing. So let me, I want to take just a few minutes to talk about our history, just to give you a hint as to how high a hill it is to get involved with the courts. And Chris mentioned that we had a suit in 93, and I'll talk about that. But in fact, it started in 1978. It was in 1978 that 16 lower income communities sued the state, contending that that the state was denying their students' rights to an equal education. The plaintiff, ironically from Brockton, a student named Roburn, I don't think I've ever heard that first name, Roburn Webby. Of course, I heard the last name for decades. The legislature responded with what turned out to be a school funding overhaul that had modest impact at best, and you know something about that. In 1983, the plaintiffs restarted Webby versus Dukakis as Proposition 2.5 was implemented, and it devastated urban communities. And the legislature did act again with very modest results. And many of you might remember, young people won't, but many of you might remember the effects of Proposition 2.5. I remember I was an assistant superintendent at the time, and we had what was called roundtables, where superintendents came together. So we had a North Shore roundtable meeting as people were preparing their budgets under the first year of Proposition 2.5, which obviously took a lot of money away from local districts and schools. And so the superintendent of schools, so the president said, let's go around and say what was the effect of Proposition 2.5. So the first one to speak was the superintendent of schools from Hamilton Wenham. And he reported that Proposition 2.5 was going to affect his school district in a big way. That their summer enrichment program, which was voluntary but well attended, was going to have to be eliminated. And after we wiped our tears away, the superintendent of schools from Beverly talked about the $1.6 million he had to cut, and talked about the number of teachers and custodians and secretaries and principals that had to be cut, and programs and professional development, etc. That resonated with me because that cut was just about what we had to do in Melrose, so that was fine. We then turned to the superintendent of schools in Lynn, from Lynn. And he simply said, you really don't want to hear from me. And he went on to describe the $4.3 million he had to cut from his budget, which included wholesale closing of schools and elimination of central office positions and principals, et cetera, et cetera. So it was quite a battle. So it kind of languished. The legislature again did something modest, and the courts just went along. And then in 1991, the plaintiffs filed again. This time, Webby has graduated, so he's too old to be named. So they picked the daughter of a firefighter from Brockton, Jamie McDuffie. And Jamie, who's now a teacher, by the way, reported that she had social studies and science classes in Brockton of 62 kids. She had to bring her chair to class because there weren't enough desks. And a book was shared by 3 students. So that prompted a lot of activity. And at the time, in 1992, Governor Bill Weld was elected, and his new board held hearings on what was called the distressed communities. And the board itself was looking for at least some temporary financial relief. Obviously, the activities from 1991 to 1993 were key, as Chris talked about, the law that passed in 93. But it was it was interesting that on June 15th, 1993, the state Supreme Court found that the state was not fulfilling its constitutional obligation on public education. And this ruling was issued, ironically, days before the governor signed our new law. In fact, the ruling came out on June 15th. The law was signed on June 21st. At the time that the ruling came out, and you never know when a ruling's coming out, of course. We knew that the court was considering it. It was ironic that the day it came out, you can imagine what was happening at the State House. They were feverishly running around trying to get the final amendments on this law, senators and representatives in the governor's office. You know how a big bill at the last minute goes. So it was ironic, during that very period is when the court handed down its ruling. It was interesting to note, and Timmy, maybe you should check your dictionaries, but the language of our Constitution said that the Commonwealth had to cherish its public schools. And the plaintiff's lead attorney found a colonial period dictionary. And the definition of cherish was quite different than it would be today. It was much more of a duty. The word cherish back in colonial days meant a real duty. And so many people think that was a key to the success of the plaintiffs. I describe in my book, by the way, I wrote a book. I'm not going to hawk it, although it is, I do have a copy. And it is called Commitment and Common Sense Leading Education Reform. However, I won't talk any more about it except to say, if you want a 20% discount with Harvard Education Press, just send me an email at Driscoll Consulting. That's easy, driscollconsulting@yahoo.com. And I'll send you a link that'll save you 20%. But I describe in the book that I became deputy commissioner in late May of 1993. And so I walked into the commissioner's office on the morning of June 22nd, which was the day after the signing of the law, which, by the way, was right up the street in Malden at one of the elementary schools. And I said, well, Commissioner, I've been here a month. I got that court case settled. We got the law passed. Is there anything else you need? You might know the law called for $2 billion in new money over 7 years, with the bulk of it, as I say, going to poor districts, bringing everyone up to a foundation level. I'm sure you are familiar with all that. Interestingly enough, after 2 years, and so it's subject to annual appropriations, so it can be pulled away any time. So it was pretty remarkable that each year they had to vote it, but it was also remarkable that the economy was growing that much. But that didn't slow the plaintiffs down. After 2 years, and now $750 million in new money, they filed again. In 1995, the plaintiffs filed again. A key legislator and author of our law, Tom Birmingham, Senator Birmingham, suggested, someone who's very supportive of the system and the efforts of the plaintiffs and so forth. But he, they got the law passed. They've now given $700 million out. He suggested, he said that the plaintiff's filing reminded him of someone who gorges themselves, burps, and says, give me some more. So you can see that the plaintiff's filing was not well received at that time. Even in 1999, 6 years after the law, and the disbursement of another $1.5 million, another refile. This time, of course, McDuffie's too old, so they find another firefighter who has a daughter, and so now it becomes Julie Hancock. And it took a while. It was sent to a single justice to hear. And in 2004, remarkably, the single justice's ruling was that the state wasn't doing enough, $1.5 million. However, in 2005, the full court overturned that. And ironically, that case at that point was known as Hancock versus Driscoll. They found at that time a system mired in failure had given way to one that, although far from perfect, shows a steady trajectory of progress. It was in that year, 2005, that Massachusetts students scored first in all 4 NAEP tests: 4th grade reading, 4th grade math, 8th grade reading, 8th grade math. No state had ever had the highest scale score on all 4 tests. And interestingly enough, sometimes in the past, Massachusetts always did pretty well, but we weren't even in the top 10 in a couple of those categories over the years when you look back. So it was quite a thing to score first in all 4 tests. And by the way, we've done it ever since. In 2015, a commission was formed to try and look at updating the foundation budget. A lot of complaints. Of course, as I always found, everybody complains. The suburbans complain. People in the southeast say, well, it's this corridor along the southeast that gets, disadvantaged by the formula. Everybody thinks they're not getting what they should. But as I mentioned, the costs have way outweighed the benefit of state funding over the last several years. There's been study after study, even after the $2 billion in new money, which ended in around 2000, 2001. Even when I was there in 2003, 2004, people were making the case that they were getting X number of dollars in state funds, but their costs, as I say, health and special education in particular, went way beyond it. And so therefore they were making cuts. And to this day, you'll read these next couple of months, school district after school district. You might have read about Brockton. Brockton has laid off I don't know how many teachers. So it is a problem even in a state that has is supposedly leading the way in equity. We'll see what happens to the effort to try and fix the foundation budget. It's a very tricky business, and as you all know, it's all about down and to the right. That's what legislators look at. How does it affect my community? So it's pretty hard to get changes in the formula that don't benefit everyone, and it's not doing a job for equity if it's benefiting everyone. So I want to now take a moment to talk about the things that happened in Massachusetts that can be replicated by other states. And it's actually a chapter in a recent book that was put out. I'm not sure what the title of the book is, but I think it's not only politically, but obviously educationally. And so I do want to talk about what, I don't know that it's a Massachusetts miracle. I mean, the Massachusetts miracle was when Mike Dukakis became governor and turned a deficit into a booming economy. They called it the Massachusetts miracle. He ran on that, left a deficit, by the way. And you know, wasn't that successful. So I get a little nervous talking about the Massachusetts miracle because sometimes they go away. But nonetheless, clearly, we did something that no other state has done. And there are, I believe, many lessons that can be learned by other states. There are some advantages Massachusetts has. We had remarkable leadership, which has to be pointed out. Jack Rennie from the business community was tremendous. The governor, a Republican governor, heavily Democratic legislature, and they all figured out how to put things aside. So let me just take a few minutes to talk about what I see are the 6 major issues that I think can happen in other states. And they're going to bounce back and forth between the political and the educational. The first, and you're well on your way here, and many other states are, ironically, by accident, this first recommendation is going to be fulfilled in America. By accident. I've been saying this for at least 10 years and publicly have said it on a number of occasions before a number of bodies, including Congress, including commissions in various states, including here in Rhode Island at least twice. And now it's coming to be. So I think I'll take credit for it, even though it has nothing to do with me. And that is that states ought to set high academic standards for their kids and regulate them in relation to NAEP. When I was chair of the National Assessment Governing Board, which oversees NAEP, we did a study on college readiness. You know, that became the 2-word phrase that we used in whatever year. We have phrases we use. Today it's social and emotional, whatever. Used to be left brain, right brain. It was the whole child. Jack and I remember it was opportunities to learn. We love these little phrases. But college readiness. So we did a study, NAGB commissioned a study. And it was an interesting study because we used real students. So we used students that scored X on NAEP and then followed those students into college and had a definition of what readiness was. And then in the case of Florida, we could follow, you know, hundreds of thousands of kids. So we did that across the country and came out with a study that basically shows that college readiness is NAEP proficient. Now you can, you know, the psychometricians can have a ball with it. I, as the chair of the National Assessment Governing Board, having a staff full of psychometricians, drove them all crazy by saying it's close enough for government work. Well, they don't like that. But the truth is, if you're a parent and your score on MCAS is proficient, and our proficient was very close to NAEP, then chances are your kid is college ready. So I think that states ought to set high standards and make sure whatever they call it for college readiness is pretty much the same as NAEP proficiency, the results. You might remember No Child Left Behind. The one huge flaw, there were 2 flaws, but the one huge one was letting states set their own standards. And so in Mississippi, 88% of 4th graders were proficient on their test. 88%. You know how many were proficient on NAEP? 12%. So I've been saying for at least a decade, we need to get truth in advertising here and set high standards. Well, state after state after state, after they either rejected the Common Core or adopted the Common Core, or adopted the Common Core and then rejected it and put in something that sounded like the Common Core or whatever, One of the silliest battles in the history of public education in America, by the way. Those that were for the Common Core and those that are against the Common Core only had one thing in common. They never read them. If you read the Common Core standards, then you're not going to be talking about doing homework with the, homework lessons with the kids. That's not the standards, etc. So the upshot of it all is that states have come out with standards that are Common Core like. Of course, they can't call them that. So there's the Hoosier standards and the Buckeye standards and the whatever standards. But slowly but surely, this country is marching towards a system whereby every state is setting higher standards and is going to be, even though under No Child Left Behind, for 10 years they published state results versus NAEP results, and nobody seemed to pay attention. So with respect to the first one, you'll be very happy that most states, and Rhode Island certainly is one of them, are going to finally accomplish that. So you only got 5 to go. The second one is the hard one, is a very hard one. And this gets into the politics. How do you go forward, move a system, particularly at a time, it's even worse these days, when there's such polarization? And let me give you, so the recommendation is take these tough issues and wrestle them to the ground and figure out a compromise. I mean, if you don't think that the public has the stomach for high-stakes testing at the 10th grade to deny diplomas, then don't go there. Figure it out. Figure out what's going to work in your state and then stick with it and go forward. So doing that and then backing off from it isn't going to accomplish things. And that's what we did in Massachusetts. There were compromises all over the place. Jack Rennie used to say everybody's going to have to drink a little castor oil, for those of us old enough to remember. So there were things to like. For example, principals under our law, principals got the right to pick their staff, which they hadn't in the past. It was done by the superintendent and the school committee. How many school committee meetings lasted till 3 in the morning to hire the football coach? So that was all taken away. Superintendents had the right to do personnel, and principals had the right to pick people in their own school. However, principals lost tenure. So there was this yin and yang, if you will, and that's crucially important. Let me give you another example, which is a great tribute to Mitchell Chester, who succeeded me, and many of you know has tragically passed away. Under Race to the Top, and you know this in Rhode Island, Secretary Duncan set some, he would say they weren't mandates, but we would say they were mandates, conditions for receiving the money. And one of those was that you had to tie student results to teacher evaluation. And there are clearly two sides, very clear sides to that argument. The first argument is that obviously from a teacher's perspective, there's a lot more to their ability and their effectiveness than just what kids can show on a test. Kids can have a bad day, kids can go through a divorce, family go through a divorce, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it seems ludicrous to suggest that you would tie a teacher's evaluation and perhaps funding salary to student results, on the one hand. On the other hand, there's tremendous studies to show that there is a strong correlation between effective teaching and improvement in student achievement over time. You can correct for those odd cases, but statistically, if you look at the work that Bill Sanders did in Tennessee over the years, certain teachers, most teachers, got a year's growth for most kids. A few teachers, about 10%, got much more than that consistently, and a few teachers didn't. And for those teachers that didn't, or for those students with teachers that were termed by Bill Sanders ineffective, if they had 2 ineffective teachers in a row, their entire trajectory of learning experiences was affected. Their entire life, their entire schooling was affected. You can't ignore those kind of statistics. And so what do? And the battles, you saw the battles, state after state after state. We're going to do 40% because we want to get the money. And then when they actually had to implement it, they backed off, and it was a mess. What they did in Massachusetts was say, look, we're going to evaluate our teachers based on a number of factors, one of which is student achievement. But it's only going to become prominent if it's an outlier. Because for most teachers, they're going to get about a year's growth for most of the kids. So student results is not going to be a big part of their evaluation. It's just going to be another box to check, which is good. And then move on. For those people who either get exceptional growth or poor growth, then it's going to be part of the evaluation. And we're not going to say whether it's 4% or 5% or 10% or 40% or whatever. We're going to let the numbers do the walking. And so I believe that all of these issues can be reduced down to something that's workable. And each state has to look at it. And if it works in Massachusetts, it isn't necessarily going to work in Rhode Island, etc. So that's number 2. That's a lot harder than number 1, which you've already done. Number 3, also very hard. This really relies on the leadership, the political leadership of the state. Balancing what Jack Rennie called the great bargain. We're going to give you the tools, not only the money, but additional monies for professional development, and there were other aspects of tools for schools and districts. But you're going to have to get results. So this grand bargain between giving the tools but insisting on results. And that battle in most states gets stopped on the first one, which is more money. Very few states these days start out by saying we're going to make a major investment in public education. But it's crucial. And then, so aren't the results. Number 4 is finding a balance between supporting the system and pushing for change in the system. Now, that may not sound very interesting or crucial, but it is. And what we're seeing today, in my opinion, is too much of the latter, which is change the system. It's not that the system doesn't have to change, it does. But there's too much of change the system, which then gets translated in the system is no good, the system is ineffective, etc. I'm going to circle back to this one to end to make the argument, and you can quote me. Public schools in America are doing, on average, on the main, a very good job. Public schools in America, on average, are doing a very good job. So what I find in this one is the balance is skewed to criticizing the system. We got to have charter schools, we've got to have alternatives. I support those alternatives. And I also support the fact that we need to change the system. There's so much illogic in the system. Just the fact that we go from September to June as if kids still worked on farms. And then let alone all the urban kids that have the summer loss. I mean, it's what business would sit there and say, okay, well, we're just going to go from September to June. And these products over here are falling behind, but that's okay. We'll just pick it up next September after we leave in June. I mean, it's crazy. So there's a lot of change that needs to be implemented. But we need to balance the system. And you're not going to change the system by dictating and bashing the system. You're just not. Anybody that's taught knows how, the teachers know how just to hunker down if they're under duress, which they seem to be all the time. The fifth one is a huge change for the system, which is focus on engaging and motivating students. For decades, our high school students have said in their top 10 complaints, they include food, and they include cliques, and unfortunately today they include bullying, etc. Maybe sexual harassment if it's the females. But the number one complaint of high school kids in America for more than a decade, maybe now for more than 2 decades, they are bored and they see no connection between what they're learning and what they're going to need in life. That's a heck of an indictment. And so that fifth one, motivating and engaging kids, is very important. And one of the great things that came out of the Common Core debate, current president wouldn't believe this, but one of the great things that came out was the sharing of information on a free website, you may know out of New York, including some of the activities and lessons and whatever. All you need to do is go in the classroom of a creative teacher and you see great things going on. Finally, and this is one that Tim deserves credit and other people in Rhode Island, you're trying and trying. And that is to genuinely bring people together and have real forums and listen. Even if you disagree, you need to listen to each other and try to figure out how to come together to get the result. And that is something that happened in Massachusetts. It's happened in other states like Tennessee. It's happened, and there's the beginnings of it here. You need the business community, you need parents, you need parents of parochial school kids, you need, obviously the legislature and et cetera. And that has to happen. And those debates have to occur so that everyone has ownership of what you're trying to do. Let me end by talking about this issue of the constant criticism of public education. I have seen a number of people, including the current Secretary of Education, but others, people that I admire, people like Mark Tucker from NCEE. They put up a chart. I'm trying to say chart. It's really a chart. They put up a chart that shows long-term NAEP. Now, this is something you may not know. I wouldn't know if I wasn't chair of NAGB. In addition to the testing, which by the way is coming out April 10th, the new NAEP testing. In addition to that NAEP testing that you're familiar with, the math and reading, once in a while you'll see social studies and science and some others. People don't realize that since 1972, there has been NAEP testing of students in America, not 4th and 8th graders, 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds. Now that's kind of interesting in and of itself to some people like me, because some of those 9th graders are in the 3rd grade, some of those 9th graders are in the 4th grade. It doesn't matter. They're 9-year-olds. They're 9-year-olds. They're 9 years old. And so there's a consistency there that's even better than the usual 4th grade to 4th grade, right? Every 4 years, it's called long-term NAEP, and we fight like heck to keep it in the budget. because everybody thinks it's useless. I think it's the most useful tool in America today. 1972, every 4 years, we test 9th graders and 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds. So you can look at the performance of 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds in 2000 and I think it was 16, and go all the way back to 1972. And for the past 10 years, well, the past 16 years, it's been flat as a pancake. And so people put up a chart, and it shows flat NAEP, long term, and increase in cost. So they make the point that in America, we have no improvement in student achievement at all, and yet we're spending more money. Ever heard that argument? Okay. Here's the truth. Simpson's paradox, not even created by Simpson. It's one of Simpson's colleagues, and he got to name it, which says, it's a paradox when all parts of something go up, but the overall stays the same. All parts of something go up, but the overall stays the same. Now, what does that mean? If you look at achievement in 2016 in America for 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds, and you disaggregate it for subgroups, you will find that the achievement of Hispanic kids is higher than it's ever been. If you disaggregate the data for black kids, you will find that the achievement of black kids in 2016 has never been higher. When you disaggregate the data for Asian kids, and you look at the results in 2016, they've never been higher. If you look at the achievement results for white students, 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds in 2016, never been higher. So how come the results stay the same? It's because of the mix. It's because there are more Hispanic students, many more black students. And even though their scores are higher, in the overall mix, they bring the average down. But they're improving. And white students are doing better. That surprised me. Everybody talks to me about the good old days. Well, we're in them. And when you consider the challenges that public schools face today, with all of the issues in society, let alone the number of students who come to us whose first language isn't English, you can knock a lot of things about the public schools, and that's why I say you have to have that balance, because we do need to change. We need to motivate kids. We need to pay attention to our schedule, how much time on task, the way we're organized, the way we use technology or don't use it properly to motivate kids, etc. But we must not forget that every day in the schools of America, we are getting results. It may not be as fast as we would like, and it certainly has tremendous gaps. And in that regard, we are falling behind other countries. But I want to leave you with the fact that we're not going to get there in any state or in this country if we continue to bash the public schools of America. With all our flaws and all our illogic. And just think, if you were asked as a parent, how's your family? How do you think you're doing raising your family? Would you say you were perfect? Please. But generally speaking, you would say you're doing a good job. That's what's happening in the public schools of America, and we need to support it. I thank you for your kind attention, and I wish you the best of luck in Rhode Island.